I've worked the graveyard shift at this particular shop for 3 years now, and I can tell you that the silence of a grocery store at 3 o'clock a.m. isn't actually silent at all. You start to notice things that the daytime staff would never hear, like the way the industrial milk coolers hum in a low-pitched, vibrating drone that starts to feel like it's rattling your teeth after the fifth hour. There is a single fluorescent bulb over aisle 4, the one with the canned soups and the baking supplies, that has this rhythmic, metallic click every 6 seconds that sounds like a tiny hammer hitting a nail. Usually, I spend my time leaning against the scuffed linoleum counter, my elbows resting on the cold surface, just mindlessly scrolling through my phone to avoid looking at the security monitors. The monitors are old and grainy, casting a sickly green glow over the register area, and they have this habit of lagging so that you see shadows of yourself moving seconds after you've already turned away. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. when the automatic doors let out that heavy, mechanical sigh they always make, sliding open to admit a gust of humid night air. I didn't even look up at first, just gave the standard, hollow greeting I've been programmed to recite 1,000 times a night. My voice sounded thin and alien in the vast, empty space of the store, bouncing off the rows of cereal boxes and soda bottles. I expected to hear the familiar shuffle of sneakers or the squeak of a shopping cart, but there was only a heavy, deliberate silence that followed the doors closing. When I finally did glance up, the breath hitched in my throat so hard I thought I might choke on it. Standing about 10 feet away from my register was a person who seemed to defy the very logic of the harsh overhead lighting. He was wearing a heavy, mustard-colored raincoat that looked far too thick for the sweltering July heat, and the fabric was stiff with dried mud and something darker around the hem. But it wasn't the coat that made the hair on my arm stand up. It was the fact that where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, taut expanse of pale, featureless skin. It wasn't supernatural, I realized as my eyes adjusted, but something far more disturbing. A skin-tight, flesh-colored morph suit or some kind of medical latex hood pulled so tight that it flattened the nose and hid the eyes entirely. There were no holes for breathing, no slits for vision, just a blank beige void that seemed to be staring directly into my soul. I felt a sharp, cold prickle of sweat break out across the back of my neck as the smell hit me. A thick, cloying scent of raw iron and something metallic, like a bucket of old pennies. He didn't move for what felt like several minutes, and I found myself unable to look away, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. I tried to speak, to ask if he needed help or to tell him he had to leave, but my throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. The figure eventually took a single step forward, and I noticed that his hands were tucked deep into the pockets of that heavy raincoat, the fabric bulging as if he were clutching something. The rhythmic clicking of the light in aisle 4 seemed to grow louder, echoing in the silence like a countdown I didn't want to finish. I started to wonder if I was hallucinating, if the sleep deprivation was finally starting to fracture my reality. But the weight of his presence was too physical, too heavy. He reached the edge of the conveyor belt and stood there, perfectly still, while the hum of the refrigerators seemed to rise in volume until it was a roar in my ears. I could see the way the latex hood moved slightly, vibrating against where his mouth should have been, as if he were panting heavily underneath the fabric. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it, a frantic, trapped bird trying to escape my chest. Finally, he reached out a hand that was trembling so violently I could hear the faint rustle of his plastic sleeve against the counter. He didn't have any groceries, no milk or bread or cigarettes, just a single crumpled piece of yellow legal paper. He pressed the paper onto the black rubber of the conveyor belt and slid it toward me with a slow, deliberate motion that made my stomach churn. As the paper got closer, I saw that it wasn't just damp. It was saturated with a dark, brownish-red liquid that was still tacky to the touch. The smell of iron intensified, becoming so overwhelming that I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. I didn't want to touch it. I really didn't, but some primal part of my brain told me that if I didn't acknowledge him, he wouldn't leave. I reached out with 2 fingers and gingerly pulled the paper toward the scanner, my eyes never leaving the blank, beige mask of the man in front of me. The handwriting was a jagged, desperate scrawl, the letters uneven and shaky as if they had been written in a moving vehicle. It wasn't a list of groceries. I realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that made the room spin. At the very top of the page, written in that same thick, wet red fluid, was my full name and my home address, including the apartment number I'd never told anyone at work. Below that, there was a list of items, but they weren't things we sold in the store. They were descriptions of the layout of my living room. The list mentioned the blue lamp by my window, the stack of books on my nightstand, and the fact that my back door doesn't quite lock all the way if you don't pull it hard. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold numbness spreading from my fingertips up to my shoulders as I read the final line on the page. It said, "You left the hall light on tonight, but I turned it off for you." I looked up, my mouth hanging open to scream, but the sound died in my throat before it could even form. The man in the mustard raincoat was no longer standing at the register. He was already halfway to the exit, his movements fluid and unnervingly fast. The automatic doors sighed open again, admitting that same gust of hot air, and then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the parking lot. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the store returning, but this time it felt predatory, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I realized then that the security monitor behind me had stopped lagging and was showing a clear, crisp image of the checkout area. In the video, I could see myself standing at the register, looking down at the bloody note with a look of pure horror on my face. But in the video, the man in the raincoat wasn't standing in front of the counter. He was standing directly behind me, his gloved hand hovering inches from the back of my head. I didn't turn around. I couldn't bring myself to move, because I could feel a faint, warm breath against the nape of my neck. The smell of iron was back, stronger than ever, and I knew that if I looked into the reflection of the glass door, I wouldn't see the parking lot. I reached for the phone to call the police, but the line was dead, the cord having been cleanly severed at some point during the last hour. The clicking of the light in aisle 4 stopped abruptly, plunging the back of the store into a deep, impenetrable shadow. I realized that the manager's office door, which I had locked at the start of my shift, was now standing wide open. I could hear a faint, wet sound coming from inside the office, like something heavy being dragged across the carpet. My hands were shaking so much I dropped the bloody list, and it fluttered to the floor, landing face up so I could see the very last scrawl at the bottom. It wasn't part of the list, just a small, hand-drawn map of the store with an X marking the spot exactly where I was standing. I wanted to run for the doors, but they remained closed, the sensors failing to pick up my frantic waving. The power flickered, the humming of the coolers dying out and leaving me in a silence so profound it felt like I was underwater. In the sudden quiet, I heard the sound of a zipper being slowly undone, the noise coming from just a few feet away near the cigarette rack. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, I'd be back in my bed. But the smell of copper and rot was too real to be a dream. I felt a cold, wet hand brush against my shoulder, the fingers long and spindly, pressing down with a strength that felt impossible. I still haven't looked back, and I don't think I ever will, because I know that whatever is behind me doesn't have a face to show me anyway. The store is completely dark now, and the only sound is the rhythmic, heavy breathing of someone who has been waiting for me for a very long time. I can hear the sound of the raincoat rustling as he moves closer, and I know that the list wasn't for him to buy anything. It was a checklist of what he was going to do once the sun went down. The automatic doors are still locked, and the silence is finally absolute. A graveyard shift at a regional supermarket like Priceway isn't exactly the kind of job that keeps you on your toes, mostly because the only thing you're truly fighting is the crushing weight of boredom. and the way the fluorescent lights seem to vibrate right behind your eyeballs after the fifth hour. You spend most of your time listening to the low-frequency thrum of the industrial refrigeration units and the occasional erratic squeak of a rogue shopping cart wheel somewhere in the back of the store. By 3 o'clock a.m., the air gets this weird, recycled taste to it, like you're breathing in the ghost of every rotisserie chicken that's ever been sold during the busy day shift. I was just finishing up a slow crawl through the cereal aisle, methodically pulling boxes of generic oat rings to the front of the shelf, so the store looked presentable for the morning rush. My hands were dry and smelled faintly of cardboard, a scent that I've found lingers in your pores no matter how many times you scrub them in the break room sink. There wasn't another soul in the public areas of the store, or at least there shouldn't have been, since we locked the front doors at midnight for stocking hours. It was just me and the automated radio playing some upbeat pop song from 15 years ago that sounded hollow and frantic in the cavernous, empty space. I remember thinking about what I would have for breakfast once I finally clocked out and could feel the sun on my face again. The light in the cereal aisle flickered once, a sharp blue flash that made the shadow of the shelving unit dance against the floor for a fraction of a second. I didn't think much of it because the ballast in those old fixtures had been failing for months, and the company was too cheap to send out a contractor for anything less than a total blackout. I reached for a box of Frosted Flakes that had been pushed too far back, stretching my arm until the fabric of my vest strained against my shoulders. That was when the music cut out with a sharp, static pop that made me jump and drop a box of bran flakes right onto my foot. Clean up on aisle 4. The PA system crackled, the voice sounding distorted and thick, like the speaker was being held too close to someone's mouth. I sighed, leaning down to pick up the box, thinking that one of the night stalkers in the back must have tipped over a jar of pickles or a bottle of olive oil again. Aisle 4 is the pasta and sauce section, and it's notorious for being the place where gravity seems to work double time on anything made of glass. I stood up, wiped my palms on my apron, and started the long walk across the linoleum floor, my own footsteps sounding unnervingly loud in the sudden silence that followed the announcement. Every step I took seemed to echo twice, once against the shelves and once against the high, dark ceiling where the shadows gathered thick and heavy. I turned the corner into the main thoroughfare, looking down the long stretch of white flooring, and saw the Neon 4 sign hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the draft from the HVAC system. The aisle looked completely normal from a distance, just rows of red and yellow boxes and jars of marinara reflecting the overhead lights. When I reached the mouth of the aisle, I stopped and frowned because the floor looked perfectly pristine under the harsh, white glare. There were no shattered jars of marinara, no spilled bags of rotini, and certainly no sign of any other employee who might have called in the mess. I walked halfway down the length of it, looking under the bottom shelves to see if something had rolled out of sight, but there was nothing but a few dust bunnies and a stray price tag. I figured maybe someone had just hit the wrong button on the intercom back in the warehouse, and I went back to my cereal boxes, shaking my head at the wasted trip. My mind drifted back to mundane things, like the car payment I had due on Friday, and the way my lower back was starting to ache from all the bending. But I hadn't even reached the end of my row when the static hissed over the speakers again, louder this time. Clean up on aisle 4. The voice repeated, but the tone was flatter now, devoid of any of the usual professional inflection you'd expect from a coworker. It sounded less like a request and more like a simple statement of fact, echoing through the empty store until it died out in the rafters. I stopped what I was doing, the box of cereal still in my hand, and felt a tiny prickle of unease crawl up the back of my neck. I looked toward the back of the store, expecting to see Dave, the night manager, poking his head out of the warehouse doors to see why I wasn't moving. The warehouse doors remained closed, their heavy rubber flaps hanging still and silent like the ears of a dead animal. I decided to head back to aisle 4, mostly out of a sense of irritation because I didn't want to get written up for ignoring a direct instruction if Dave was watching the cameras from his office. As I approached the pasta aisle again, I noticed a smell that definitely shouldn't have been there. Something heavy and bitter that reminded me of old mechanical grease and something metallic, like a handful of wet pennies. It was a thick, cloying scent that seemed to coat the back of my throat, making it hard to swallow or even catch a full breath. I rounded the corner and stopped dead, my eyes fixing on a spot right in the center of the aisle where a small pool of dark liquid was sitting on the tile. It wasn't red like sauce or clear like water. It was a deep, oily black that seemed to absorb the light from the overhead lamps rather than reflecting it. I stepped closer, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud in my chest, and I realized the pool was growing, expanding outward in a slow, rhythmic pulse, as if it were being pumped from somewhere deep beneath the floor. It looked like industrial waste, thick and viscous, and as it spread, it began to creep toward the bases of the shelving units with a quiet, wet sound that made my skin crawl. I looked up at the ceiling, thinking maybe a pipe was leaking from the roof, but the tiles above were dry and stained with nothing but old, yellowed watermarks. The liquid seemed to be bubbling up directly through the grout between the floor tiles, a dark, bubbling wellspring of filth that felt fundamentally wrong. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave that aisle, a primal instinct telling me that the black sludge wasn't something I should be touching or even breathing in for too long. "Dave," I called out, my voice sounding thin and shaky as I looked toward the back of the store where the manager's office was located. No one answered, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic hum of the freezers and the slow, sticky expansion of the black pool on the floor. I walked toward the back, intending to find someone, anyone, to help me figure out if a pipe had burst or if we were experiencing some kind of chemical leak. I passed the bakery department, where the scent of cold yeast and sugar usually hung in the air, but now all I could smell was that metallic bitterness. The manager's office was at the end of a short, narrow hallway near the loading docks, a place that always felt cramped and claustrophobic even on a good day. The office door was slightly ajar, which was strange because Dave never left his post during the night shift without locking up or at least closing the door firmly. I pushed the door open, the hinges giving a long, mournful creak that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my teeth. The room was completely empty, the only light coming from the computer monitor, which was flickering with the gray static of a lost feed. The desk was a mess of papers and half-empty coffee cups, but Dave's keys were sitting right there on the blotter next to his phone. The PA microphone was sitting on the desk, its neck bent at an awkward angle, and for a second, I could have sworn I saw a smear of that same black liquid on the foam cover. My hand started to shake as I realized that if Dave's keys were here, he hadn't left the building, but he certainly wasn't in his office. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps, and that's when the speakers hissed to life for the third time. "Clean up on aisle 4, the voice said, and this time I realized with a jolt of pure ice in my veins that it wasn't Dave's voice at all. It was a recording of me from earlier in the night, or maybe a perfect mimicry, but the cadence and the slight rasp in the throat were unmistakably my own. I stood frozen in the hallway, the sound of my own voice calling for a cleanup echoing off the cinder block walls in a mocking loop. Why would there be a recording of me saying that? I had never said those words into the microphone tonight or any other night, because I wasn't the one who made the announcements. The realization hit me that someone was playing a game, someone who had been listening to me, watching me, and perhaps even recording me as I went about my shift. I turned and sprinted back toward the main floor, my sneakers slipping on the polished floor as I tried to gain traction in my panic. I didn't want to go back to aisle 4, but the only way to the front exit was to pass by the mouth of that row. When I reached the main thoroughfare, I slowed down, my eyes darting around the shadows that seemed to have grown longer and darker in the last few minutes. I looked down aisle 4 as I ran past, and the sight nearly made my legs give out from under me. The black pool had grown so large that it was now spilling out into the main walkway, a massive, obsidian lake that looked like a hole torn in the world. It was no longer just a puddle. It was a flood, and it was moving with a purposeful, crawling motion that defied every law of physics I knew. And then I saw them. A pair of heavy, mud-caked work boots standing right in the middle of the sludge, the dark liquid swirling around them like it was alive. There was a man standing there, wearing a tattered store uniform that looked decades out of date, the fabric frayed and stained with years of grime. He was tall, his frame lean and angular, but his face was obscured by the deep shadows of the aisle and the brim of a low-hanging cap. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his head tilted to one side, holding a heavy, industrial-sized bucket that was slowly tilting to spill more of that black, foul-smelling filth onto the floor. I stopped, my chest heaving, staring at this figure who didn't belong in my world or my time. He wasn't a ghost. I could hear the wet sound of his breathing, a heavy, rattling noise that suggested his lungs were as full of grit as his boots were of mud. He was a man, a physical, tangible threat, but there was something in the way he stood, perfectly still, perfectly patient. That was 1,000 times more terrifying than any monster. I realized then that the sludge wasn't a leak or an accident. It was a trail, a way to keep me coming back to the same spot until he was ready to step out of the dark. The PA announcements hadn't been a glitch. They had been a lure, a psychological hook to reel me in. He had been waiting for me to find him, or rather, for him to find the right moment to let me see him. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on him, afraid that if I blinked, he would be right in front of me. He didn't move a muscle, but the black sludge continued to flow from his bucket, spreading across the white tile like an ink blot on a clean sheet of paper. I turned and sprinted for the front doors, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached the registers and fumbled with the heavy ring of keys I had taken from the manager's office, my fingers feeling like lead. I tried the first key, but it wouldn't fit, and I let out a sob of frustration as I glanced over my shoulder. The man was no longer in aisle 4. He was standing at the end of the register line, his boots leaving thick, black prints on the floor. He wasn't running. He was just walking, a slow, methodical pace that suggested he knew I had nowhere to go. I finally found the right key and jammed it into the lock, turning it with a desperate, frantic strength that nearly snapped the metal. The heavy glass door swung open, and I tumbled out into the cool night air, the transition from the sterile store to the real world feeling like a physical blow to my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the key into the ignition. I peeled out of the parking lot, the tires screeching against the asphalt, and I didn't slow down until I was several miles away under the bright lights of a 24-hour gas station. I sat there in the driver's seat, gasping for air, the smell of that black sludge still clinging to my clothes and my skin like a curse. I looked down at my hands and saw a small smear of the liquid on my palm, and when I tried to wipe it off, it felt cold, colder than ice, a deep, numbing chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I looked back toward the direction of the store, half expecting to see those black footprints following me down the highway. I never went back to Priceway, not even to collect my final paycheck or to see if Dave was ever found. I heard through the grapevine that the store closed down a few weeks later, officially due to unforeseen plumbing and environmental issues that the company couldn't afford to fix. Some people said the building was sinking into the ground, but I knew better. I knew it was being swallowed from the inside out by something that had been waiting there for years. I moved to a different city, took a job in a bright, crowded office where I'm never alone, but the fear hasn't truly left me. Sometimes when I'm in a quiet place, like a library or a late-night pharmacy, I'll hear a crackle over the intercom system, and my heart will stop for a beat. I'll stand there, frozen, waiting for a voice that sounds like mine to call for a cleanup in an aisle I'm standing in. I wonder if that man is still there, standing in the dark with his bucket, waiting for the next person to answer the call. And most of all, I wonder what happened to Dave, And if he's the one now tasked with cleaning up the mess that never ends. Every time I see a black mark on the floor, my stomach turns, and I have to remind myself that it's just dirt, just a scuff, just normal life. But the smell, that metallic, oily scent, sometimes drifts through my vents at night, and I know that nowhere is truly safe once you've seen what's hiding under the floorboards of the mundane. I keep my lights on now, every single one of them, because I can't stand the thought of a shadow that doesn't belong to me. I haven't stepped foot in a supermarket since that night, opting for delivery services and small corner stores where I can see the exit at all times. People think I'm paranoid, but they weren't there to hear their own voice calling them to their death. They didn't see the way the black liquid pulsed, like it had a heartbeat of its own. They didn't see the man who was just a man, yet something so much worse. I hope the store is leveled, turned into a parking lot or a park, but even then I think I'd stay away. Some things shouldn't be disturbed, and some messes are meant to stay hidden in the dark. I still have the key I took from the office, a heavy piece of brass that feels like a weight in my pocket, a reminder of the night I almost didn't make it out. I should throw it away, toss it into a river or a trash can, but I can't bring myself to do it. It's the only proof I have that it was all real, that I didn't just have a breakdown in the middle of a shift. Every now and then I look at the key, and I can see a tiny, dried speck of black on the metal. It doesn't wash off, no matter how hard I scrub, and it seems to be getting just a little bit bigger every year. I wonder if it's waiting for me to go back. I wonder if the cleanup is finally ready for me. I've worked the closing shift at the Big Value Mart for 6 years now, so I'm pretty used to the creepy silence that settles over the aisles once the last customer is ushered out at 11. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being the only person in a 60,000 square foot building, lit only by the dim, bluish hum of the emergency lights and the occasional flicker of a dying fluorescent tube overhead. You start to hear things after a while, like the groaning of the HVAC system or the way the metal shelves expand and contract with the temperature changes, and you learn to tune it all out. Tonight was supposed to be a standard Tuesday night, just a quick sweep of the perimeter, checking the locks on the loading dock, and then heading home to a cold beer and some mindless television. I started my rounds in the produce section, walking past the misting machines that always make this low, hissing sound that reminds me of someone whispering just out of earshot. Everything looked normal there, just some stray lettuce leaves on the floor and the faint, sweet smell of overripe bananas that seems to permeate the air no matter how much we clean. I moved through the bakery next, where the smell of yeast and sugar is usually comforting, but tonight it felt heavy, almost cloying, like it was coating the back of my throat. I checked the ovens and the proofing cabinets, making sure everything was switched off and the back door was bolted tight, which it was. It wasn't until I reached the back of the store, near the bulk goods and the paper products, that I felt that first real prickle of unease on the back of my neck. We had received a massive shipment of toilet paper and paper towels earlier in the week, way more than the shelves could actually hold. So we'd built these enormous, towering displays right in the middle of the main floor. These stacks were nearly 12 feet tall, giant cubes made of 30-pack bundles, creating a literal wall that blocked the view of the backstock doors. As I approached the display, I noticed a smell that definitely didn't belong in a grocery store, something thick and sour, like unwashed skin and stale breath. I stopped walking, the rubber soles of my boots squeaking once on the polished linoleum, and I listened as hard as I could. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the hum of the freezers. But then I heard a soft, rhythmic rustling coming from inside the tower of toilet paper. It sounded like paper being moved around, or maybe someone shifting their weight on a pile of plastic-wrapped rolls. My first thought was that we had a major rat problem, which happens occasionally in these big stores, especially when the weather turns cold outside. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from my belt and clicked it on, the beam cutting a bright white path through the shadows of the paper aisle. I walked around the perimeter of the massive display, looking for any signs of a hole or a collapsed section where a person could have crawled in. When I got to the back side, the side facing the industrial refrigerators, I saw it. A small, rectangular opening about 3 feet off the floor. It was perfectly cut, not torn, as if someone had used a box cutter to remove a few of the 30-pack bundles from the center of the stack. I leaned in closer, the sour smell becoming almost unbearable now, and I realized it wasn't just a small hole. The entire core of the display had been hollowed out, creating a hidden room inside the massive wall of paper products. I shone my light into the opening, and my heart nearly stopped when the beam hit a pair of wide, unblinking eyes staring back at me. I jumped back, nearly tripping over a floor display of dish soap, and my breath came in short, jagged gasps as I tried to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't a rat. It was a man, his face pale and smeared with something dark, sitting cross-legged in the center of the hollowed-out paper fortress. I opened my mouth to shout, to tell him he had to get out or I was calling the cops, but the words died in my throat when I saw the others. A woman was sitting behind him, her hair matted and dusty, and she was holding a small child who looked no more than 5 or 6 years old. They were all wearing clothes that looked like they'd been scavenged from our own apparel section, but they were filthy, stained with food and sweat. The man didn't look scared or even surprised that I'd found them. He just looked at me with a calm, territorial intensity that made my skin crawl. I finally found my voice, though it came out much shakier than I wanted it to, and I told them they needed to leave right now. I told them the store was closed and that I was the manager, and that if they left quietly, I wouldn't call the authorities. The man didn't move. He just shifted slightly, and I realized he was holding a sharpened piece of metal shelving in his right hand. He spoke then, and his voice was a dry, rasping sound that felt like it was being scraped out of his chest with a dull knife. He said they weren't going anywhere, that they'd been living in the store for 3 months, and that they had everything they needed right here. He told me they'd been coming out at night, long after I'd finished my rounds, to take food and water and whatever else they required. I realized then that all those small inventory discrepancies we'd been having lately weren't just clerical errors or shoplifters during the day. They had been living right under my nose, watching me do my rounds every single night from their hidden vantage point inside the paper aisle. I told them again to get out, my voice rising in pitch as panic started to take a real hold of my senses. The man stood up then, but he didn't come out of the hole. He just stood there in the dark, his head brushing the top of the hollowed-out ceiling. He told me that they had chosen this store because it was big and because the manager, me, was predictable and lazy in his checks. He said they knew my car, they knew where I lived, and they knew I was the only person in the building with a set of keys tonight. The woman behind him started to hum a low, tuneless song, and the sound of it echoing inside the paper walls was one of the most unsettling things I've ever heard. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand, as I realized the gravity of the situation I was in. I was alone in a locked building with 3 people who had clearly lost their grip on reality and were prepared to defend their home. I turned to run toward the front of the store, toward the office where the landline was and where I could hit the silent alarm. But as I reached the end of the aisle, I heard the sound of plastic rustling behind me, much faster than before. I didn't look back. I just sprinted, my boots pounding against the floor, the sound echoing through the empty store like gunshots. I made it to the front office and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice on the tile. I finally got the door open and scrambled inside, slamming it shut and locking the deadbolt just as I heard a heavy thud against the wood. I stood there, gasping for air, listening to the sound of someone scratching at the door from the other side. It wasn't a frantic scratching. It was slow, deliberate, and rhythmic, like someone testing the strength of the wood. I grabbed the phone to call 911. But when I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone, just a dead, hollow silence. I looked down at the base of the phone and saw that the line had been neatly snipped, the white cord dangling uselessly from the wall. I realized then that they hadn't just been hiding. They had been preparing for the moment I finally noticed them. I looked at the security monitors on the desk, but the screens were all flickering with static. The camera feeds cut one by one. I looked at the monitor for the backstock area, and for a brief second, I saw a movement in the rafters above the loading dock. There were more of them. Not just the family in the toilet paper, but others. Shadows moving with a terrifying familiarity through the upper reaches of the store. I realized then that I wasn't the manager of this store anymore. I was just a guest in someone else's house. I'm currently sitting in the office. The heavy steel door, the only thing between me and whatever is waiting in the aisles. The scratching has stopped, but I can hear the sound of the store's PA system clicking on. A low hum of static filling the building. I can hear the man's voice, distorted and echoing through the speakers, telling me that it's time for the final sweep of the night. He says they've already locked the exterior doors from the outside, using the master chains from the garden center. I looked out the small, reinforced window of the office door, and I saw the family standing there in the dim light of the lobby. They aren't hiding anymore. They are just waiting, the child holding a small, sharp toy and the man still clutching that piece of metal shelving. The lights in the store just went out, all of them at once, leaving me in total, absolute darkness. I can hear the sound of the office door handle being turned, slowly and firmly, over and over again. I don't think anyone is coming to open the store in the morning, because tomorrow is a holiday, and I'm the only one scheduled to be here. I can hear the man whispering through the crack in the door now, his voice almost gentle as he tells me how much they appreciate the space I've provided. I'm writing this on a notepad by the light of my dying flashlight, hoping that someone finds it if I don't make it out. The air in the office is starting to feel thin, and the sour smell is beginning to seep in through the vents. I can hear the sound of the ceiling tiles being moved aside directly above my head. I don't think I have much time left before they decide to come in and finish the sweep themselves. There is a soft thud on the desk behind me, and I'm too afraid to turn around and see what they drop through the ceiling. I just want to go home, but I think this store is the only home anyone is going to have for a long time. The flashlight is flickering now, the beam growing dimmer and yellow with every second that passes. I can hear the man laughing softly on the other side of the door, a sound that is entirely too human and entirely too cold. He's calling my name now, asking me if I've checked the inventory on the heavy-duty trash bags in aisle 9. I'm not going to answer him, but I don't think it matters anymore. The scratching has started again, but this time it's coming from inside the room with me. I can feel the draft from the open ceiling tile on the back of my neck. I really should have checked the displays more carefully when they first arrived. It's too late now. The light is almost gone, and I can hear someone breathing right behind my chair. My keys are still on the floor where I dropped them, and I can see them glinting one last time before the dark takes everything. I hope the next manager is more thorough than I was. I really do.